Good afternoon, chers sénateurs, mesdames et messieurs, dames and herren. It's a great pleasure to be here in the Senate, and particularly in this SUPERDEMOCRATIE series. Nothing could be, I think, more pertinent at this moment for the Senate to be discussing, and also for the senators to be discussing with citizens in the room. So it's a really fantastic collaboration between the Senate, the Beaux-Arts, and Full Circle. So I'm going to talk today about one of the themes that was set by the Senate, who gave a fascinating series of Latin terms, just to remind us where many of our ideas about democracy have come from. I chose the one cogitatio, and I've interpreted it as a sort of post-Cartesian idea. Not so much I think, therefore I am, but I think, therefore I vote. And yet, if my thinking is changed by modern life and the way that the world is changing, how does that affect how I vote? So I'm going to start with the open society and the role of democracy in the open society, because I work for the Open Society European Policy Institute. And open society foundations were set up very much inspired by the philosopher Karl Popper, a German who taught for many years in Britain, and who came up famously with the book in the middle of the Second World War, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, he said many interesting things about the open society. I put one of them up on the screen, the one about an open society being one in which men, I hope, and women, have learned to be, to some extent, critical of taboos and to base decisions on the authority of their intelligence. That's a very Cartesian idea, that I make my decisions based on my intelligence, based on my thinking. He also was very strong as a philosopher of science in applying the scientific method to politics. So the scientific method is one in which you can decide what is true and what is false. And it's very important to be able to have a way of proving falsibility. That's one of his major contributions to the philosophy of science. And he also argued that an open society is one in which no one person has a monopoly on the truth. No one person can say to everybody else, I know what's true, and so I'm telling you this is how our society must be run. And because of that, citizens must look at the evidence and they must think critically for themselves. For Popper, every citizen was applying the scientific method to politics. They were deciding what is true, what is false, they were applying their intelligence, and they were not going on the basis of the things he criticized Plato for a great deal. So taboos, he mentioned in this particular quotation, but he also criticized Plato for defending lying, political miracles, tabooistic superstition, the suppression of truth, and ultimately brutal violence. Now, recent neuroscience and also research in political psychology have shown quite clearly that Popper's idea of an open society and how democracy functions in one are very far from how we all actually make decisions on a daily basis, and particularly very far from how we decide about our political choices. I think it would be no surprise to any of the politicians, the practicing politicians in this room, or indeed the practicing voters in this room, that politics has never really worked out as expected by philosophers like Popper, or indeed economists who believe in a perfectly rational homo economicus, who behaves in very predictable ways by weighing up his cost-benefit ratios and making decisions one by one in a very rational manner. In fact, recent research in political psychology has discovered that quite a lot of voters, many, if not most, actually decide whom they're going to vote for based not on a rationalistic comparison of the detailed policy platforms of each party. No, they vote by instinct, and they vote by tribe. They vote for the people they feel are part of a particular group in society. And that's not surprising, because that is how political parties have developed in our democracies. Farmers, public sector workers, entrepreneurs are going to be looking for different kinds of people to represent them. And they typically vote for the party that seems most closely allied with their interests. But they do so more by instinct and responding to slogans than by exactly what that party does in government. Now, this is not new. This is something that's been there in politics for a long time, which is why I think there's perhaps an overblown panic about the state of politics today. We've had some really quite extraordinary decisions by voters over the past couple of years, producing Trump in the White House, Brexit, a lot of new radical parties either gaining power or certainly gaining a lot more influence. But politics has always produced swings of support, and voters have always used instinct, belief and tribe as non-rational means of deciding who to vote for. But what I'm going to do this afternoon is to tell you about two new elements in the super-democracy that is emerging in the digital age. And both of them actually relate back to ancient philosophy. One is about epistemology, which is what we know and how we know that we know it. And the other one is about ethics, what is right and what is wrong. And this is really about our voters losing their capacity to think critically. And there's now a lot of very interesting research from several different academic fields which gives an insight into whether voters are losing their capacity to think critically in the way that Popper and others imagined an ideal democracy would require. There's research about how voters really decide. And there's also a lot of interesting research about the role of fear, real and imagined fears, and how much that can close the mind of the individual voter, closing your mind to alternatives and closing your mind to uncomfortable thoughts becomes much more attractive in the digital age. So what exactly has changed? The first is that relativism has become extreme. Many philosophers have pointed out that there is no absolute truth. Immanuel Kant, for example. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. There's something that Trump could agree with. But something has in fact changed. Relativism may date from the 18th and 19th centuries, but the quantity of information and the speed of information flow and the proliferation of sources of information are occurring at the same time as a fall in deference to authority. So a fall in deference also to government and to politicians, but also to experts of all kinds, including scientists. It's quite remarkable how in some important democracies like the United States, scientists have been really degraded in the public view, partly over the issue of climate, where there's been a deliberate campaign to do so, but also in general, people do feel that they've had enough of experts, in the words of the British minister Michael Gove, who tried to deny various facts on the grounds that experts didn't matter in the Brexit campaign. And there's been an overall fall in trust. And this has changed attitudes towards facts and lies. It's allowing post-truth politics to emerge. It allows politicians to get away with things now which they couldn't before. So I give you three examples from different parts of Europe. So in Germany, there were in the German media stories that had come from the Russian state media about a girl called Lisa who was supposedly kidnapped and sexually abused by immigrants in Berlin. There was actually no evidence of such a case ever existing, and the German police rather quickly got to the bottom of the story and denied it. They denied publicly that happened. Yet the Alternative für Deutschland party used this case to organize a demonstration in Berlin and got people to turn out and brought them to the verge of violence on the basis of something that had never happened. Another kind of post-truth politics that emerges is misuse of statistics, and here I give you an example from Austria. So Sebastian Kurz, who is very likely to become Austria's chancellor next week after the elections on Sunday, was caught out for having used a graphic on his website which reported a change which had never actually changed in Austrian statistics. And this was something where, in the past, there would have been a big scandal about this in the middle of an election campaign. But by then, the number of scandals and the number of very hot items in the election campaign had been so great that he shrugged it off. And finally, I give you an example from the country that I know best, the British Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson. Perhaps his most famous generosity, shall we say, with the facts, or the non-facts, was that his claim that Brexit would liberate £350 million a week for the National Health Service, which was actually he was called out for misuse of public statistics by the Statistics Authority, by the experts on statistics. But he consistently denied that he did anything wrong, and he declared on British television that the £350 million was actually in the Conservative manifesto, which within 5 minutes, anybody who read it could see it wasn't. So how do governments get away with this? How do politicians get away with this? If you think about how in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in the United States, there was the Watergate scandal, and President Nixon actually had to resign after being caught lying. So why is it now possible to misuse public statistics deliberately, to organize a rally on the basis of a false story? Well, it's because it's a very different era. And why is that happening? So I give you a few reasons. There are actually many reasons, but I'll just give you some of the four most interesting. And there are some particularly interesting statistics and figures about Belgium in this. So one is a generational shift in where people actually get their news and their information. So, for example, half of Belgians over the age of 65 read a newspaper every day, and 93% watch TV news. Whereas 15 to 24-year-old Belgians use the internet every day. 15 to 24-year-olds use 88% of them use the internet every day, but only 17% read a newspaper. So you've got a big generation gap in terms of where they're absorbing information from. And of course, if the younger voters, or those who are just voting for the first time, are getting their information online, we know that that's actually much easier to manipulate through artificial intelligence, and it's much harder to know online what's a good source of information. That makes it extraordinarily difficult to disentangle fact from fiction, because there's already information overload, multiple sources of information. It's harder to tell what's a good, reliable, trustworthy source of information and what's not. And then you have deliberate manipulation. Then you have stories on, for example, Russia Today, as I mentioned, the Lisa story, and Breitbart, which is now setting up in Europe. And they compete with public broadcasters. Governments and newspapers are losing their monopoly on being the most authoritative source of news and facts and explanation of what's going on. And of course, social media, which in Britain, for example, 70% of people say that they get their news from social media. On social media, anybody can be a publisher. There's no intermediation of an editor who worries about the reputation of her newspaper if she publishes false facts or inflated statistics. Anybody can open a Twitter account or can have a Facebook page which attracts thousands, even millions of followers. The second reason why things really are changing is because the role of tribe is different. Political parties are tribes to a large extent, but the information overload and the breaking up of familiar identity containers in society changes the way that people relate to parties. We can see all over Europe how some of the very long-standing parties, some of them are actually dying. Think about PASOK, which is out of the Greek parliament for the first time in 150 years, for example, or the SPD in Germany, which has had to go into opposition because it was unable to motivate its traditional voters, and Germany is one of the most stable party systems, it must be said. And of course there are plenty of others that we can think of. Think about the Partij voor de Arbeid in the Netherlands as well, which had a historical low in the last election. Now, why is that happening? Well, it's partly because of social change. People's line of work is changing. Then there isn't a big cohort of industrial workers who identify with a Labour Party, for example. Also, the way that people have multiple overlapping identities, and they are used to having online an ability to having multiple identities. By that, I don't just mean people who create a different avatar from their daily self online, but also people who, for example, they might have quite different preferences as a consumer online from those that they vote for as a voter. And this means that people are not necessarily listening to the literal content of what politicians say. This is how politicians like Trump can get away with some quite extraordinary claims. For example, Trump claimed that US unemployment was not 5%, which was the official statistic, but it was 30%. That wasn't true, but it felt true to a particular part of the electorate. And one of the American comedians came up with the term truthiness. He says Trump doesn't tell the truth, but there's a kind of truthiness about what he says. And truthiness is something that is not subject to fact-checking. It's something where the listener is seeking messages about whether the speaker is saying things that matter and seem to be true for his or her tribe. So it doesn't matter so much whether the statements are actually factually true or correct. There's a very interesting book on this phenomenon called Democracy for Realists that I recommend. Then we have spin. Now, spin has been with us for quite a long time. Spin is presenting a story in a way that is most favourable to the teller of the story. Everybody has done this since Homer. In the country I know best, Tony Blair's government took spin to a high art form in the late 1990s. Now, I think there is a backlash against spin going on because political communication is so slick nowadays in many countries that voters start to value authenticity over factual truth. Populist politicians are very skilled at sounding more authentic than the polished professional mainstream party people. So when you join up spin with lies and deliberate manipulation, you get a very complicated picture for the voters to understand. And finally, there's the issue of disengagement from politics. Membership of political parties is in free fall in most parts of Europe. That means that parties no longer perform the educative function of explaining issues to their members within the party. Think about things like the Workers' Education Association that the British Labour Party had, and others, particularly on the left, have often had a sort of school of politics as part of their activities. In the 20th century, this is dropping away completely now. So now I'm going to move on to the epistemological crisis. How do we know what we know, and can we know that we know anything very much when we're drowning in information and misinformation? And there's a lot of very interesting work by psychologists and neuroscientists about how our brains react to information overload. Essentially, most of what they do is to seek shortcuts to understand the world and what's going on, what's technically called heuristics. And there are two ways that using shortcuts with your mind affect politics. One is that we simply have very low tolerance for cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you know that two things you're being told two contradictory things at the same time, and your brain just goes, no, I can't quite deal with this. And your brain will automatically seek what the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on thinking fast and thinking slow, he calls it cognitive ease. Cognitive ease is when your brain goes, yes, okay, I can see how things pan out. I'm not having to decide between these two contradictory things. And your brain does that automatically, often subconsciously, and very quickly. And in politics, voters are constantly being presented with cognitive dissonance, claim, counterclaim, argument, counter-argument. And so they seek cognitive ease. And one of the shortcuts they make is to decide partly who to trust, but also what kinds of facts they're going to trust and which ones they're going to dismiss. And this is actually resulting in a whole new field of study among political psychologists called agnotology, which is a term I hadn't come across before I was preparing for this lecture. But agnotology is the study of culturally induced ignorance or doubt. So basically, when the world around you seems so confusing, then moving into ignorance is actually easier than moving into doubt. And technology has exacerbated this problem because of this breaking down of identities which used to be based on religion, profession, class. And in politics, what it means is less interest in breaking down complex problems and instead a big seeking of simple solutions. The philosopher Jonathan Haidt explains that we like to think that we use reasoning and analysis to reach a judgment. For example, we might think that we're going to look at the evidence around genetically modified crops to decide whether they should be banned or not. But in reality, we do the exact opposite. So the exact opposite also of what Popper said we should do. We come to an intuition-based judgment early on, often subconsciously, and then we build an argument around our judgment. And then we go out and look for evidence that supports the judgment we had already decided we were going to reach. And we simply don't listen to evidence. We simply cast aside evidence which seems to point in the opposite direction. So in politics, this has the effect of switching off to data. The minute a politician starts talking about facts and data and puts up statistics, you'll notice I'm not using any statistics on the screen today for this reason, and falling back instead on intuition and belief. That's simply what the brain does. This isn't even something that is necessarily conscious. It's something that the brain does. But it's something that is very much exacerbated by the information overload and by the use of spin and the use of post-truth politics. Which takes us to a rather big moral crisis. It's hard to know what's true and what's false, and that changes the incentive for everyone, including politicians, to be truthful. When trustworthiness is regarded as only one option among others to get votes, when there are very few penalties from departing from facts and truth, voters are actually very wise to trust their sources less. They're wise not to trust politicians, and that, of course, causes an overall fall in trust in all politicians, not just in the populists, the Donald Trumps of this world, but all politicians, because they can see that people are getting away with untruths, so they're not sure who they can listen to, whom they can believe. And, of course, the web makes this worse, too, because it's anonymous. People can tweet under a false name, or they can put out things onto social media or in chat rooms anonymously. The usual reputational effects and other sanctions against misinformation simply fail to apply. So whereas if your work colleague or your friend told you a manifest untruth, or even just something that you weren't really sure about, that would affect your view of that person, online, you simply don't have that context to make sense of whether they're telling you the truth or not. So when there are no costs to bear for lying, anything goes. And yet, people continue to believe what they read online, in spite of there being very dodgy sources. And this is because, again, we come back to the brain science, it's really uncomfortable to be in a state of doubt. So this is where the epistemological problem and the moral problem collide. If you don't know what to believe and you don't know who to believe, and then there's an incentive for everybody to be quite fast and loose with the truth, then you have a real problem with politics. And populism is, unfortunately, making these moral challenges a good deal worse. One of the reasons is simply to do with technology, that populist politicians were very early adopters of social media, and they still use it more effectively than mainstream parties do. For example, it was the far-right parties that started using Facebook to create a tribe, to create followers very early on, long before the mainstream parties had got their act together on Facebook. Parties like the Front National, but particularly there was the English Defence League and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. They got onto Facebook very early. And they also used Twitter to interact with voters. We did a study with Demos, a think tank that works on social media, about how, for example, MEPs use Twitter. And we did a specific study of the 9 months around the 2014 European Parliament election. And most MEPs, particularly from mainstream parties, use Twitter to broadcast messages. They just send out essentially very short press releases through Twitter. Whereas some of the most active Twitter users in the European Parliament, like Nigel Farage, use it conversationally. They use it to get feedback from voters and from not necessarily voters, but people who interact with them on Twitter. And they tweet other people's stuff as well. So they create more of a conversation. So they have an amplifying effect through social media. They have a bigger impact on the public by using social media rather more aptly than mainstream politicians do. And this matters greatly because of the effects that social media have on how people understand the world around them, including politics. Social media is very effective at amplifying threats, which is, after all, what populists have always done. So when populists are using social media, you get especially big impact on threat. And when people hear about existential threats all the time, that has long-term effects on how and whether they engage in politics. So what it tends towards is simple answers and claims to have the absolute truth. Populists are especially appealing when mainstream politicians keep saying, it's very complicated, we are examining the data, we are looking at the evidence, and we will weigh up an outcome. And the populist goes, it's really simple, you need to cancel this or pay for that. But that makes it very difficult to have a political debate about trade-offs and about complex policy issues where there is no obvious solution. Think about climate change, for example, or even how to deal with transport in Belgium. There is no obvious solution, but it can sound like there is when a politician comes along and says, just forget about all of them. They're all in hop to special interests. I give you a simple answer. Social media also tend to amplify the populist effect, or maybe populists use social media to amplify their message about more conflict and less compromise. Social media tend to have an effect of normalizing conflict and violence because they can be used to create a tribe and then to keep the tribe in fighting mode. So think about the way Donald Trump is constantly picking a fight with somebody. You only have to look at the headlines to see that every week there's a new enemy of his he has to fight. So this week, I think it's been the major news media, hasn't it? They shouldn't be allowed to say whatever they want to. That's what he said this week. Really quite extraordinary in terms of freedom of speech. But the reason why he's constantly finding an enemy to pick a fight with is to keep his supporters mobilized and in fighting mode. His supporters already have a very short attention span because they're constantly on social media, which does reduce our attention span. And then the constant appeal to sustain the fight amplifies threats and makes conflict feel normal and justified. And that has the very strong effect of making people see the people on the other side not just as opponents, the people you disagree with, but as enemies, which is a classic thing that populists do, that you identify the other side as being an enemy, not an opponent. And you cannot compromise or negotiate with an enemy because you can't trust them. So that's a very different way of thinking about politics, and it leads to a lot more conflict and less compromise. And it's very inimical, ultimately, to social peace and harmony between peoples. And finally, the battleground of politics is moving from policy choices to identity as a result of populism, from offering a vision of society to protecting the interests of a tribe. So that's why people are, when they're hearing what a politician says, particularly a populist politician, they're listening for the signals that he or she is part of their tribe. They're not taking, for example, Trump literally when he says he's going to build a wall. He's really going to build a wall against Mexico. What they hear is, oh, he shares our concerns. He's one of us. And this, of course, ultimately affects trust. It means that the promotion of individuals who make these claims becomes much more dominant in politics, and institutions much less. And that affects how much people trust institutions, and they do trust them less than they used to. So the statistics on Belgium about trust are actually rather interesting. Political parties, I'm afraid, are not very much trusted by Belgian voters. But the trust in the national parliament is relatively high in comparison with other countries. It's around 50%, which in most Western democracies is very high. So you'd be glad to hear that here in the Senate. But young Belgians, so these are the under 30s, trust the EU more than they trust any national institution, which is also a very interesting finding. That's not the case in certain other member states, particularly the one I know best, I'm sorry to say. So I'm just going to finish with a few thoughts about the scale challenge, and then I'm going to conclude with a few ideas about remedies. So the scale challenge is that the challenges faced by politicians and by democracies as a whole are increasingly global, but politics is increasingly local. Now, so the big issues like climate change, also economic policy, are so tied up with a very complex, interdependent system of business, of economics, but also of people's individual choices. And what happens on the other side of the world affects us here in Belgium more and more. Interdependence is a fact of life. And this makes people actually very nervous, and they tend to go more local in politics. Now in Belgium, with this very complex system of multi-level governance, people can actually work out their choices at local level. But we see that, for example, in Scotland or in Catalonia, the growth in the idea of make everything more local, make everything more regional is the answer, is gaining ground. So I think this is a very interesting phenomenon. And it has quite major implications for the European Union, because the EU was supposed to be set up. All of its competences are famously supposed to be decided on the principle of subsidiarity, that decisions should be taken at the lowest appropriate level. But there are more and more issues that are appropriately at EU level because they cannot be dealt with by any one country or one community on its own. They are inherently transnational. Climate is the classic example of this. But there are also plenty of others. The euro has brought a degree of interdependence that makes governance of economies an issue for every member of the Eurozone. And yet at the same time, although the EU has a lot to do with these transnational problems, politics goes local, and in many countries the support for the EU has fallen. I'm thinking particularly here about Greece and Italy, where it used to be extremely high, and it's now gone much, much lower. Hasn't changed very much for Belgium, you'll be glad to know. But there are also implications for open societies, because if you're expecting local politicians to be able to deliver solutions to global challenges, you are bound to be disappointed. So what does that mean in terms of your willingness to engage in politics? So to finish with, what are the hopes for remedy? I think in the end, actually, Popper was right that critical thinking is the remedy. But you've got to be able to think critically and make up your own mind and come to your own conclusions and resist brainwashing, while also coping with the massive increase in the pluralism and the quantity of sources of information. And that requires the ability to discern between sources and to use our brains more actively, what Daniel Kahneman calls thinking slow mode. It's uncomfortable, it's more painful, it uses up a lot of energy, but that's what we really have to do if we want to remain autonomous, thinking beings who are not subject simply to the latest trend on Twitter. But these thinking skills are ones that we as individuals can develop. They're also ones that need fostering across our lifetimes and throughout our societies. If you think about the rapid pace of technological change within our individual lifetimes, it's actually really hard to keep up with the proliferation of news sources, with all the things that are going on. So I would argue for lifelong learning on digital literacy. It's certainly something that needs to be there in schools, in education. I think it's really important that actually children learn philosophy in terms of critical thinking and how to decide, how to make up your own mind, what is true, what is false at school. But it's also something that has to continue over all your lifetime. You don't want children to grow up believing everything they're told or shutting out all input except the ones that confirms the instinctual judgments that they've already come to. Children also need to be able to tell a credible source from a bad one, but so we also need to do in middle age and in old age. It's also very important that we retain our resilience in terms of our mental abilities. And so I would suggest to all of you that in the short term, what we can all do as individuals is actually to go on a news diet. So my personal news diet is I don't take in any more than 5% of my daily news calories from Trump. I only read the headlines, because if you start reading the stories and get sucked into the reality TV show of US politics, then you don't take in the nutritionally much better for you kinds of news about what's happening in other parts of the world, for example, or in our own societies. So just as you limit junk food intake into your body to protect your physical health, you need to protect your mental health by limiting your intake of junk news. That's hard to do. It's really hard to do on social media. It's why I've stopped using Facebook. But you've got to limit your intake of Trump food to the headlines only, in my view. And then there's talking to people outside your tribe. This is really important because social media create filter bubbles, as the experts tell us, where you tend to listen to only the people who agree with you, who are like you, who have a similar lifestyle to you. It's really important to maintain your contact with other people in other parts of society, in other countries, people over the border, and so on. And that's for two reasons. One is because it helps to keep your mind open to other people's point of view and to understand what's going on. It also helps you to trust other people. And that's a very important way of having mental resilience against populism. Because populists constantly tell you, you can't trust people who are different from you. You can only trust people who are like you and like me, and that's it. Whereas if you actually talk to people who are different, you discover quite different things from them. And I cite here a very interesting study from Austria about what happened to the vote for the Freedom Party, the FPÖ, which is likely to do extremely well on Sunday in the upcoming election. This was a very conservative part of Austria where there was a high level of intolerance of refugees. People did not want refugees to come to their commune, their local commune. But the whole region had to take a certain number of refugees in order to spread the burden across the whole country. And so there was something of a natural experiment whereby the different communes actually received, so you had a similar voting pattern, but they received different numbers of refugees depending on simply whether they had enough school gymnasiums and other closed down old people's homes and other kinds of large facilities to receive the refugees. And the extraordinary thing was that the communes which received more refugees, particularly above a kind of critical mass, actually stopped, the vote for the Freedom Party went down because people actually met the refugees and talked to them, and they became part of the local community, and that actually reduced the vote for the Freedom Party. So that's just that's one small experiment, one small study on one small part of Europe. But I think it's an interesting example of how when you talk to people and you engage with them, people who are not like you, that can help to change your views of things. And also, it's very important to have contact with real issues, especially transnational ones like climate change, because contact with thinking about how do we solve this issue together not only keeps you engaged in politics in a constructive way, but it also helps to keep your mind open amidst all of the real and unreal and the imagined and the exaggerated fears that the media are full of, and particularly social media are full of. And I would just like to end with a question for the room. Especially for everybody here who votes in Belgium, like me, what should the fifth bullet point be compulsory voting? Belgium is very interesting in being one of the very few advanced democracies which has compulsory voting, and it's also, of the small number, the one that has the highest turnout within compulsory voting. It's typically 90% or above. And I'm very curious as to whether you think that helps to engage people in politics. Is that something that actually brings particularly first-time voters, when they turn 18, into politics in a way that keeps them more interested throughout their lives? What kind of impact does it have? Because I think it would be great to have another remedy to offer to voters. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Yeah? We have until 2, is that right? Is that okay? Yes, there's one here, I think.
Hello. Between the lines of the 4 suggested remedies, there's something that I think is really crucial, probably between the second and the third line. Digital literacy and news diet. I think the importance of good, reliable media that serves the public interest is pretty essential. So if we take the point of view of a citizen, we have a say in this. We can actually support the real good media. We can learn to discriminate what's a good media. And we can pay a subscription for a good media, for example. It's very straightforward, but it really helps. From the point of view of a government or even European institutions, it's actually promoting good media, giving support. And I tend to see a lot of conversations that conclude overwhelmingly that digital media literacy is important, but I'm not hearing a lot of conversations on how to do it, and I don't see a lot of budgets going in there. So I would love for the conversation to shift now to, okay, how to do it and where is it being done well, what are the best practices, and so on. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think this is a very interesting question, and I don't have a ready-made answer for it, so no simple solution. Because I think there's definitely a case for a public sector broadcaster who is regulated. So an institution, obviously here in Belgium we have the 2 different languages, but essentially the news, and sometimes the news can be a bit different. It's actually very interesting hearing sometimes the news from the, for example, Clara, as opposed to the news from Musique 3. You get a different take on the same events, but both of them are subject to regulation. Both of them, if they were to put out blatant lies or false stories, they would be picked up really quite fast, not just by the listeners, but also by the media regulator. So the argument for having at least one source of authoritative news which is regulated by a public institution, I think is very strong. And countries that don't have that, for example, the United States, you can see what happens. It's very easy for the media to get very fragmented and brought up. But given that the media are also subject to market forces, that creates an interesting dilemma, because do you subsidise the public broadcaster? Many countries do, over private sources, and also, do people continue to listen to the public broadcaster, or does their market share diminish even though they're regulated and they have public subsidies? It's a really interesting and difficult question, and particularly given the generation gap in where people get their news from. How do you maintain that, and how do you ensure that for 15 to 24-year-olds it's still enticing to listen to them? So I think there is definitely a role for the state. But the other question is is it possible for any one state to regulate the media? You know, the way we're set up at the moment is we have national regulators of the media. So any Belgium-based media outlet which has a legal basis in Belgium can be regulated by the media regulator here. But people here may well be looking at Russia Today, for example, or Al Jazeera, or any number of social media sites that purport to offer news, which are not based in Belgium. And how can the Belgian regulator deal with that? Now, some countries do deal with that by blocking them. Turkey is an example, China is an example, Azerbaijan is an example. I'm not sure I really wish to follow that particular example. And Trump saying, this week, the media should not be allowed to say whatever they want to. People should look into that. I find very scary, because that's restriction of freedom of speech. So how do you deal with this? Should there be a truth and falsehood regulator? I think there certainly should be a body that can be appealed to by a reputable source. But the only real way to deal with it, I think, is that the listeners and the viewers need to have some resilience internally. So I think there's an interesting point you said between 2 and 3 about the role of the state, but that's not just the answer in itself. I think you need to have multiple different answers. Yes, please.
Yep. You were speaking about perception and the way it works better than facts, especially for the youth. Our next elections here in Belgium will be local elections, the commune, and it's certainly the election which touches the most the youth, much more than Senate elections, unfortunately or fortunately. How would you suggest the parties to address the youth towards those elections specifically?
Oh, I don't have an answer for this one.
I mean, because this menu is not really going to work with them.
Well, there's a very interesting question about the future of political parties, because they're clearly losing support. I mean, membership, as I said, is in free fall in most countries, certainly in Europe, and actually in quite a lot of other places in the world as well. People don't join parties the way that they used to, and they have low levels of public trust, including here in Belgium. I mean, it's like 17% among some parts of the, some age groups in the population trust political parties. And yet there is no replacement, just to reassure all the politicians in the room, there is no replacement for political parties. How else do you run a parliament if you don't have political parties? It's very difficult to see what would be alternative sources of debate and being able to decide things democratically. Yes, we can think about, the citizens' assemblies that Macron has asked for, where he particularly suggested to do this at local level, at commune level. There's also other methods of deliberative democracy that can be done at commune level. But ultimately, parties seem to be an institution which is losing support, losing trust, but which can't really be replaced and remains very important in the democratic system. So the question is, to come back to your question about what happens in the commune, is it possible to engage people in commune issues, local issues about transport, about schools and so on, in a way that gets them to think also about the big picture and takes them into politics? Parties used to be the vector to do that. If they're not doing it, I would suggest the parties need to think about their role. But what's your experience as a citizen? Do you find that some parties do that much more effectively than others?
I was talking about the youth in particular, eh? And I missed that in your answer. I know that the coolness factor is certainly a thing which works under 30 years old, but especially the communes. I mean, the youth is really bothered about, hey, will my kids have a school? near my home, and real things like that, which is also politics, of course. So that's my answer to your question.
No? Yes, thank you. I'm very much interested because we are in the Senate here, which is a chamber of the parliamentary system, but gentlemen as well focused on local elections. Could you say that the more local you are, the more direct elections can be? Because, as you mentioned, we have to decide at local level if it's a football stadium or if it's a theater, a school nearby. So people are really involved. They know the issues. But the higher you get, climate change, for instance, is an issue which the average, like my humble self, would not understand. And we have to get experts involved. So in very simple terms, in a kind of multi-level governance system, the higher you get, the more expertise, the more technocracy you need. And in this way, wouldn't you even say that at national level already, as we see last year, the Anglo-Saxon shocks we had, Brexit and Trump, the direct elections are a problem because people do not really understand the issues well enough to be able to vote in the right direction. Right, of course, is to be interpreted. But these two shocks, for me at least, have shown that direct elections are not really possible at national level or even sometimes local level. It's difficult already. So this kind of grading upstairs to the global level of governance, would that mean we need more expertise the higher you get and less people involved?
I'm not sure, because there are a lot of issues at local level where expertise is needed. For example, I live in Ixelles and we're having a big traffic big traffic reorganization. And I would actually like more expert advice on, for example, whether air pollution is going to be significantly better or worse. And I think that's something you can't just decide at local level. You need expertise on that. And likewise, climate change will affect Ixelles as well. And it will affect how we manage air quality, for example. And so I think expertise is needed at every level, and people are needed at every level. The question is, how do you maintain the legitimacy of different levels of government? And this is where we come back to the subsidiarity issue of if decisions should be taken at the lowest level that's relevant for them, that makes sense. That's essentially a federal system, as is recognised in Belgium. But of course, each level of government has an incentive to try and take as much of the issue, as much power as it possibly can. That's what political systems do. And what we've seen in the last few years is a turn against the idea of international institutions that have this kind of role, particularly because of the United States turning against them. So the denigration, for example, of the UN Climate Commission, which was a really important body of scientists and others taking expertise on climate. Of course, as we've seen, the denigration of the European Union in some places. And other regions don't have anything like as elaborate as the European Union at regional level. So I'm not sure that there is an ideal scale for governance, but there certainly is a strong argument for expertise at every level, and also to make sure that for voters it's obvious why every institution is needed. Because voters don't want to pay for, as you were referring to, the technocracy if they feel like there are too many levels and it's not necessary. Now, every country finds its own way through that. Belgium has a particularly elaborate system, and other countries have fewer levels, fewer different public institutions. But that's something where perhaps you need to have a constitutional revision every few generations to discuss, is this still appropriate? And I fear that the sort of super-democracy of the digital age doesn't actually improve that. It doesn't provide an easy answer to that. It provides more opportunities to engage in politics in different ways, because you don't just have to be a member of a party. You can go online and express your opinion. You can take part in a deliberative poll. It provides many points of access to politics, but it doesn't provide an answer to the question of where should decisions be taken and what level of expertise is needed.
Congratulations on your excellent presentation. A simple question, which is on a broader subject. Do you think the European quote-unquote union will still exist in 10, 15 or 20 years?
The European Union? Oh, yes. I think it definitely will. The thing, I worked in the Commission as a political advisor, and I saw plenty of things that needed to be changed and improved in the Commission. But one thing I was really struck by throughout all the time I was working there was just how many challenges are transnational and becoming more so. That it's getting harder and harder for any one country on its own to deal with everything from terrorism to cross-border crime to cybercrime to as well as climate, and even things like unemployment. It's hard to deal with it in one country when you've got movement of people. So the interdependence in the world means that the European Union is a really vital way of Europeans increasing their global weight by having a strong regional union. And there are plenty of ways in which the EU has lost credibility and has lost popular support. It's come up a bit since Brexit. I'm glad to know that there's at least some silver lining in that cloud. But there are plenty of ways in which I think the EU does need to go through another period of considering how it should remain relevant in this century. But I don't think it's going to go away. If it did, it wouldn't be a sudden, quick disintegration or collapse. It would be a very slow becoming irrelevant, a bit like the League of Nations, I think, rather than a sudden political collapse like a government can have, because it has a set of institutions which are very deeply embedded in the political system of most European countries, as the UK is now finding out. It's actually really, really complicated and expensive to withdraw. So that example may well deter anybody else from doing so. So yes, I would actually put a lot more money on the EU still being here in 20 years' time than the British Conservative Party. Do we have time for one more? One more, okay. Please go ahead.
A comment on compulsory voting. For foreign residents in Belgium who have been granted the right to vote in municipal elections, the fact that it becomes compulsory once they register actually acts as a disincentive. And it's one reason why fewer than 15% of eligible foreigners vote. And I think that's particularly unfortunate in a district such as yours, Ixelles, where half the population is foreign and are therefore de facto disenfranchised.
Thank you. That's a fascinating statistic, which I didn't know, that only 15% register to vote. I must admit, I thought it was... Oh, no, it's not automatic. I assumed that when you get your identity card that you're automatically registered to vote, but you're right, there is a separate form that you have to do. I just filled it in like a diligent citizen and sent it off and went and voted. That's really interesting. Okay, so voting is actually only compulsory for Belgian citizens. What a pity. All right, maybe that's the next thing. Make voting compulsory for all the foreigners living in Belgium.
It becomes compulsory once they register.
Once you register to vote. Okay. That's very interesting. Thank you. That's an interesting point. But what do you think? Do you think that for Belgians, compulsory voting is a good way of getting people to engage in politics? Are they more engaged in politics than in neighbouring countries where it's not compulsory?
I think I should let Belgians comment on that.
Is there anybody? Please.
I'm from Italy, and and my girlfriend, she's from Belgium, and something she remarks often is that when we are among the Italians, we speak more of politics than anyone else she knows in Belgium. So I don't know if this is an indicator of political engagement, but at the same time, I also remark that there is certain, at least we like to talk as well, so I don't know if it's just at a talking level, but to me probably Italians are more daily involved, I would say.
Interesting. Well, I think there's clearly material for another lecture on this subject. So I hand over to Madame la Présidente, and thank you all very much. It's been fascinating.